Good morning, Doris.
Good morning.
Well, I've had the pleasure of working with you on the Bar Association of San Francisco board for at least a couple of years now. For those who may not be as familiar with you and your work and what you do, would you mind introducing yourself?
Well, I was born and raised in San Francisco native, and went to Lowell High School, stayed in the city, went to college at UC Davis, but then came home, literally lived at home with my parents while I went to law school at USF. And then soon after that started with the same law firm where I am now, and that's Walkup Melodia, Kelly and Schoenberger.
And you've been at one law firm for your legal career.
That's right.
You describe elsewhere about your decision to choose law as a path, and it sounds like it's not something that was obvious to you from the beginning.
Right. I really had no idea what I was going to do when I finished college. I knew that I wanted to just be, educated. I liked the idea of learning something new all the time. College was a great place to explore that, especially at UC Davis, where it was so different than San Francisco. And I remember the first year, I took as many different things as I could, from physics to calculus to genetics and English, lots of English courses. And I thought it was fun. I really had no idea what I was going to do. And I really thought I'd probably work in an office or something, maybe be a receptionist. And that certainly wasn't the path that my life ended up going.
And you've described elsewhere that it wasn't an obvious choice for your family either, to the extent that they had input in what you do as a career.
Well, that's true. My father was a cook at the old Iron Pot restaurant. It was called the Iron Pot Restaurant, and it was a great Italian restaurant over on Washington Street next to the fire department, and he would take us to work every now and then. They were such great people who worked there, and my godfather was the owner of the parking lot just adjacent to the restaurant. And then my mom cleaned houses while we were growing up, so there really, I don't think anybody in our family ever explored being a lawyer. I think being in an Asian family, the obvious push from my mom was going to medicine, be a pharmacist. That'd be a nice, steady thing to do. And but I knew I wasn't terribly interested in any of those things. That's not really true. I suppose I might have been interested in some of it, but I never thought that I'd be able to do the chemistry, which was probably like my least favorite class in high school. Calculus, which I really did not enjoy in college, despite taking it. And then, and the reality was I got done with my English major with a creative writing emphasis at Davis, and thought, I have no idea what I'm going to do. And my classmates from high school, many of them were going into law, many of whom were English majors, and other people who were going into engineering and medicine. And out of that collection, law seemed the easiest path. And I had these student loans I had to pay off. Right? At the point when I was going to college, the UC system was fantastic. The tuition was low. When I went to UC Davis, it was $1,800 a year. It was incredibly reasonable and a great encouragement for people to get a college education. But in my sophomore and junior years, there were tremendous fee hikes that, made summer jobs no longer just a feasible alternative for being able to support my way. And I supported myself through college. So I had to take student loans out in my junior year through senior year. And, when you look back at that point in history, it doesn't seem now like it was a lot of money, but when you're coming out of college at 20 or 21 years old, it was daunting. And one way to certainly defer your student loans was to go back to school. And so I ended up in law school with greater debt, but I remember somebody telling me that, these are opportunity costs, and you're looking at an opportunity to invest in yourself. And it was probably one of the most inspiring things that I heard at that time. Like, I guess I'm actually putting money towards me, not really just the school itself.
Mm-hmm. And that makes me think, too, the situation facing students today where $1,800 is probably what you pay in student fees
right.
nowadays, is my guess. And even public schools will charge tens of thousands of dollars in tuition each year. And I think, too, one of the issues that's come up in the past couple of years, in parallel with the cleaving of the unified bar into two separate entities, is the high cut score for the bar exam, where many people who spend tens of thousands of dollars in law school cannot practice law. And I wonder if you've had any thoughts about that, sort of the investment that it takes nowadays. I mean, talk about investing in yourself. Nowadays, you really have to know that this is something that you want to do, to pursue that path wisely.
We have seen a huge drop in law school enrollment, I think in part because of the high cut with the state bar, and that is at least certainly California. Mm-hmm. And that's been going on for a few years. I don't think anyone has really cracked the code or completely understood how it is so seemingly different now than it was at other points in history when people were taking the bar exam. I think it's incredibly discouraging. But I think for students who are interested in the law and passionate about the law, the reality is California is the hardest place to pass the bar. Historically, it had been New York and California. And the reality is there are other places to practice law. We are such a global society now. We are much more mobile. I don't think that we all have to invest our roots in California. My parents were immigrants. What courage it took for them to leave China and Hong Kong and build an entirely new life is, part of the American dream. It is part of, even on a national level, that people don't always stay in one place. And so, there's a lot of really important work as representatives for other people who can't speak for themselves. From our own Bar Association work, mm-hmm. we've witnessed issues with immigration, and they're not just in California. We're facing it across the nation, and that work that needs to be done doesn't have to be done here. So I think there are many more opportunities for young lawyers who want to serve and want to take care of people, the society, and really a holistic society, one that does care about each other, that does use the law for protection, that does use it as a shield and not always as a sword. Mm-hmm. And those are places that are not limited to California. So I think that's one way to look at it. I think the other is, in terms of the California schools, as we struggle with trying to build a curriculum that makes sense for students today, students are learning differently. My sister's a fifth grade teacher. She's witnessed the change to a core curriculum, the universal curriculum, and so the way that we are teaching students has really changed. And law schools have always done it a very traditional way. But if that's not reflective of the way that the bar examiners are looking at student scores, or if that's not reflective of the way that students are processing information, then that needs to change also. And I think when I consider our students and how adaptable they are now, I used to learn by taking handwritten notes, memorization. And it turns out that's a very slow way to process information. Mm-hmm. And students today, they take photographs, they take snapshots, they video record or audio record information. And the writing out of information isn't a mechanism for them to learn anymore. Mm-hmm. And they're much more visual. And so, how do we adapt our teachers who have been traditionalists, our professors, to catch up to that? I think there are a number of things to consider. And I know law schools, in the Bay Area are trying to figure out the key to that. And we're watching, I think, a growth and a struggle. And I'm going to make a pitch here for this is all the more reason to invest more in our teachers and our professors, because they're adapting to the way that our society is growing.
Doris, I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about your family's path. You said that your parents were brave enough to immigrate from Hong Kong, and do you know what was it that caused them to make that choice?
Both of my parents are from Hainan Island. It's a island with about 1 million people on the southeast corner. It's about an hour flight from Hong Kong. It's very close to Singapore. In fact, there's a lot of just immigration between Hainan and Singapore. My father left Hainan when he was only 17, and it was the Japanese invasion of Hainan, and the Japanese occupied Hainan for about 6 years. Yeah, my father left shortly after the invasion, and so he ended up for a bit in Singapore, Hong Kong, and ultimately New York. And then he was a merchant seaman for a long time, lived in New York as home base, and then made San Francisco his home base. My mother, meanwhile, was 10 years younger than my father, lived in a different village, had actually lived through the Japanese occupation, and then with communism and kind of the great trifecta of things that happened, from the famine to other things, in roughly 1958-59, she left Hainan with her family and moved to Hong Kong, where there was just tremendous textile opportunities, and people were, things that were suddenly made in Hong Kong had great value. And so she worked in a sewing factory, so where the textile industry was really booming, and she also worked in a Singaporean restaurant. And my dad was roughly 46, and he was living in San Francisco as a bachelor. He decided that he should get married, and he contacted, I think, the matchmaker in Hainan.
Oh, okay.
And it connected my dad with my mom, who was then in Hong Kong. And so he flew to Hong Kong, married her, and after several months, she was able to move to San Francisco, and they were married in Hong Kong, and so she moved here. They both became naturalized citizens in 1974. So that was their journey.
So your mom, she lived through some hard times in China.
And that was a big part of the reason for moving. My grandfather was really upset about their land being taken away. I mean, they were agriculturalists, they were farmers, and that was really how her family, made a living. They'd sell their produce at the market, and then it really wasn't theirs anymore. And my grandfather, I think before that, that was always, I think, what the home was, but he had also lived in Vietnam and was sending money home to Hainan. So there was, I think, the Cultural Revolution, there was just a string of things, the whole change in the country that affected them directly. And so they ended up, one by one, basically leaving. And my mom left and took her 2 younger brothers. Her parents followed, and they were living in Hong Kong, I think, about 10 years before my mom left for the United States with my dad.
And it really was a leap of faith for both of them in many ways. So for your dad to leave and then become a merchant marine, be based in a country quite different, in New York City, and then decide to go to San Francisco, and then to meet your mom through a matchmaker, that's also a leap of faith. And for her to immigrate to the United States, bring her 2 brothers with her. What was, do you know, what was it for your mom that kind of made that a good decision? So in other words, how did she view kind of the choice in staying versus going to a land that she hadn't lived in before?
Well, I mean, where my mom, she easily was one of the strongest people I have ever known in my life. I mean, she passed away in 2013. And so, she really made two moves. There was the move from Hainan to Hong Kong. That was one move. And that, I would say, was a matter of survival and necessity. They needed a better way of living, and it wasn't, I think from my mother, it really wasn't a choice. Whereas when she got married, I think that was a choice. But at that point, I think a very good choice for her. She was in her 30s, didn't have children, I think was ready for all of that. And, here was somebody from the same village. And we never talked about it that much. It was always described to us as sort of a fait accompli, like, the matchmaker paired them up. And my dad went over there and picked out his bride, and they got married there. And so, but I do think because there was familiarity, and they were both living in some place that was not their homeland. So I think there was some comfort for each of them. But you're right, I think it was a complete leap of faith at each of those points. And it certainly feels as if those are things that they instilled in us without ever even having a real talk about that. But their life examples, were very good inspirations for us.
What was their experience like in San Francisco at that time? They became citizens in 1974, and but your dad lived in the United States for much longer than that. For your parents, did they ever describe to you what those early experiences were adjusting to life here?
For my father, my father was a good collector of things. He wasn't a hoarder by any stretch, but like keeping certain papers and important papers. And I remember coming across a lot of letters to his lawyer and declarations and affidavits. And I asked him, what were these papers? And he never talked much about the type of discrimination that he faced. But when I asked about those papers, he told me that, I had to get an immigration lawyer like every 6 months because, immigration would come after him, and, he'd have to basically renew his visa or residency. And so it was just an ongoing thing. And I found that really interesting because my parents never talked about lawyers, never talked about government or the law, and it always seemed kind of taboo in some ways, I think because of what my mom also went through with government, their feeling about government in China when her family left for Hong Kong. And so it was just a small glimpse, into a time that I think was probably really difficult for my father, but they just never talked about it very much. I think the overwhelming lessons that they taught us was much more about adapting and assimilating. How do you live in a place where the culture is not familiar and where people don't look like you? I mean, we had a great mixed neighborhood in San Francisco, and the first 3 years of my life was in Chinatown, over by Leavenworth and Jackson. And then my parents bought a home in the Richmond district, not far from University of San Francisco, actually. And we grew up there, but there was a mix of Asian families, Black families, and white families. And so for all of us, I think it was just learning how to get along.
So you were born and raised in in San Francisco, and it sounds like your home for the first 3 years was in or near Chinatown at Leavenworth and Jackson.
Right. Yeah.
So you really are a San Franciscan.
Through and through.
As coming from a family where there's a family history and a cultural experience of skepticism with government, perhaps politicians, perhaps lawyers, I have to imagine that informed your parents' perspective on your choice of the law as a profession.
More so on my mom's side than my dad's side. I think my dad, just having traveled so extensively, I mean, as a merchant seaman, he had visited the Congo, Netherlands, so many different places in the world. And I think he was very open to anything that his children wanted to do. My mother, on the other hand, is such a pragmatist. As I said, I think the move from Hainan to Hong Kong for her was very much one of survival. It was very practical. It was a good decision because it was pragmatic, and it was what was necessary. And so when I was looking at going to law school, and I remember I had a conversation with her and told her I'm going to apply to law school, and she looked surprised and a little, I don't know if the word was a little heartbroken, but because she said, well, you already have a good job. I was at that time working as a paralegal in a law firm. It was basically my first job out of college. And, making $18,000 a year seemed like not necessarily a standard of living, but a good steady job in an office. And I wasn't cleaning houses and I wasn't cooking. So it seemed like I was on the right path, at least for my mom. And I think what she never really said was that her family members really might think differently or maybe not be so approving. And I think she would never impose that on us. But I really discovered that later. A few years later, I went to visit relatives in Hong Kong with my parents, and we had taken a short trip. It was a couple weeks. And the relatives that were originally from Hainan, we met some of them who now were living in Hong Kong, and they were really dismissive. And they were really unsupportive, and it basically said things like, lawyers really don't do anything, they just talk all day. They don't make anything, they don't create anything. And they had really this image of, or it seemed at least what was being conveyed to me, this image of lawyers really just eating, drinking, and talking all the time, and that it really wasn't a productive use of time. So it was very humbling to be among, some of my mother's relatives who really didn't think much of the legal profession, and probably with good reason. With the government having changed, certainly during my mom's time, I think the ongoing struggles with any society, but also with China, with corruption. I mean, we've seen that through and through again. I've done quite a bit of international teaching. We've taught and trained lawyers from Japan, China, the UK, Mexico, and the Caribbean, all these different places where there's an effort, a genuine effort to make their civil society stronger and to make sure that there is a rule of law. So I found that with even the delegation that I was training who was visiting from China. And so, at different points, things sort of made sense to me, and I understood a little bit better why there was not enthusiasm, perhaps, from my mom about going to law school, incurring greater debt for something that really may not be a noble profession.
I wonder today, as one of the few women to regularly achieve multi-million-dollar verdicts, you've been the president of various bar associations, you're the current president of the Bar Association of San Francisco. Do your extended family members feel differently about your choice now?
I have not been in touch with the ones that are living outside the United States. So I think the feeling of, as I said, that disapproval really came from the family members that were living outside of the United States. The ones that had, like my uncles, they are so supportive, and they always have been. But I think that is part of just feeling the closeness of family. And at every opportunity, they are, contrary to what we grew up with, incredibly supportive and endorsing. And I say contrary to what we grew up with because I think as we were growing up, particularly in the Asian culture, the way that our family praised us was to tell us we were not doing well. And so it's the reverse as we get older now. Now they actually say, oh, that's really great. Or, they saw something in a magazine or a newspaper and they're very proud of the work that I'm doing. So it is very heartwarming to get that support. And you realize certainly like how important it is to have family and family that is that supportive.
One of the things that you spend your scarce time on is advancing the rule of law outside the United States, and you described talking with, I guess, a delegation from China. I know you've gone to other countries too to speak on the topic. What is it about that topic in particular that is meaningful enough to you that you choose to spend your time that way?
First, when I attended law school, I think, growing up in San Francisco through, the 70s, there's a fair amount of, I guess, difficult treatment among, just as a ethnic minority. We were still feeling the effects, I think, of the Vietnam War, and other kids would at times, make fun of us, believe that we were Vietnamese or that we all looked the same. And so I definitely felt that as I was growing up, the sense of inequality, and I think handled it the way that my parents really taught us, which was to transcend it. We didn't examine it too closely because the emphasis or the effort was much more on how do you assimilate and overcome. Mm-hmm. But I think when I was in law school, one of the things that I became passionate about was, the disparate treatment of African Americans and Asians or other people, ethnic minorities, in the rule of law. And I really thought I was going to do, criminal defense. Mm-hmm. I took an intensive advocacy class, and it was a trial course at USF, and it's actually the course that I'm currently the program director for. And that's, I'm an adjunct professor at USF and now run that course. But it was the first place in law school where I really felt at home. It was a 2-week trial advocacy course. Back then, the program was really 1 week of pretrial things and taught people basically how to hang out their own shingle if you needed to. But the second week was being in the courtroom, and I loved it. And you could feel that it really was, at least in its purest form, before you even talk about, like, do you have jurors or not, or who's judging the case, do you have, and who your judge is, all of those various things. But, a place where your arguments were on the merits, your passion and persuasive powers were for a cause and for a person. Notwithstanding that there were, corporations or things that were involved in the cases that we talked about. But it was a place where I think I felt, number one, the most comfortable, and number two, that it was really at its, like I say, highest form, a place of equal footing. And so the work that I think it just grew out of that for me was trying to find as many opportunities as possible to be involved in trials. And the law firm where I ended up going right after law school, and it was through a connection through the intensive advocacy program. One of the professors there was from Boston and knew my law partner here in San Francisco, and so it connected me with this law firm, which is a trial firm. And the philosophy at the firm is also one of, the importance of the Seventh Amendment to a jury trial, the importance of the rule of law. And I'm not the only partner there who has taught internationally and nationally on that topic. And so in these countries now where I've done the most work, it's because the United States already has a presence. We have either a U.S. embassy, we have a connection now. There were two major entities that we were working with, that I've been working with. One was the State Department, the DOJ, and now it's really the National Center for State Courts. And when it was through DOJ, they had a program called OPDAT, and the Overseas Prosecutorial Development and Training. And that was where a lot of the rule of law work was being, facilitated. And so I just continued to do that.
Well, I can't help think about our experience today since 2016, where we've seen, and perhaps even before, where we've seen a politicization of both the DOJ and courts and federal judges, and it puts in sharp relief just how important it is to have an independent judiciary, to have independent judges, because if parties cannot resolve their disputes in front of what's at least mostly viewed as a neutral party, then that undermines one's faith in the entire endeavor.
Right. And I've seen that, we've seen that a lot in different countries. Where the rule of law is not strongly upheld, and you can see it in places where it's made a priority. In the United States, it has been made a priority. There's the right to a speedy trial in your criminal cases. There's a right to a jury trial in your civil cases under the Seventh Amendment, as I mentioned. But I was teaching just this past year in Trinidad, and a lot of the teaching is with legal aid and the prosecutor's office. Mm-hmm. And in those places, they could have cases drag out for 10 years where they don't see resolution. You don't hear about that as much in the United States because, as I said, we have these mechanisms of getting cases resolved. But there, where people's human rights are at stake, I was sitting in a bail hearing in Trinidad, and there was a gentleman who had been arrested but not even yet indicted, mm-hmm. and it was 10 years.
Wow.
And so for 10 years he'd been coming to court every 3 or 6 months to let them know he hadn't fled the country, he was still there, mm-hmm. and that he has to make regular appearances to the police department, and that's a huge infringement on people's rights, on his rights. Mm-hmm. We think about rights as not just our individual rights about, the things we've talked about, race, religion, gender, sex. Those are some genuine fundamental ones, but other fundamental ones are, the right to move, mm-hmm. To be mobile, to have transportation, to have communication. Those are the things that actually make a sophisticated society, and the inability to move. This is one of those things that keeps people insulated. So those were some of the things that, you get to witness and think they really do need not just a spokesperson for their rights, but also somebody who looks at the courts and the infrastructure, the management of all of that. And that's another place where we don't always talk about what the rule of law really means. Mm-hmm. How does it affect people's day-to-day function, and not just at the micro level, but at a much sort of global way, because it does trickle down. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that analogy makes me think of how as well as we might protect our citizens, and we have the Bill of Rights and various rights that are laid out in statute and common law, that once you're outside those borders or in between, that we start to see phenomena that are very similar to the way the person in Trinidad is treated, right? So we have instances of indefinite detention after 9/11.
Right.
We have moves to indefinitely detain without due process migrants crossing the border, asylees. It seems pretty like a pretty stark difference, and wonder if it's intrinsically valuable to give people due process and to apply the rule of law, how we can treat people so differently.
I think it's critical, things that you've just mentioned, things that we see in the United States, I think that's much more born out of fear and probably an unfair sense of self-preservation. In a lot of other places, it's just a way of life. It's, it's just where they choose to put their resources and money, and it's not always in the rule of law. But I think as lawyers, we see for a functional society, it has to begin with the rule of law, because we all have to have some agreement about the core values that we have. And if we have an agreement about that, and then the administration of it and the prioritization of it becomes important, so that you can, enforce what everybody agrees to be at least fundamentally fair. Mm-hmm. And that begins with due process, to say, here's a process by which everybody, at least, no matter what the issue is, no matter what our innate fears are, because everybody's going to have a different fear, and everyone's going to have a different philosophy or a different religion or, whichever, but there should be some common core ground rules mm-hmm. that say whatever our views are, we can at least come to this place, this mm-hmm. forum, and have it adjudicated in a way that, whether you agree or disagree at the end of the day, at least the process was fair. And I'm a big fan of, if you take care of the process takes care of the event. And at the end of the day, we can all at least live together and live with the result, because people, at least in the process, were treated equally. Mm-hmm. And that's the beginning of fairness. But, if you start to unduly detain people because of a perceived threat born of a singular fear that isn't a universal fear, and then that creates the inequality of disparate treatment. When you talk about the unfair treatment, when you have government, I think that one of the most important things is you don't ever feel oppressed by the government. And so if you don't have, as they say, kind of a, excuse me, if you don't have a system where it feels like it's being administered equally or fairly, then you don't have a functional society. And I think, when we think about having gone to law school, what we learned about the law, all of that, a lot of it comes back to, this is, and I've said this many times to my law students, this is a social pact. Our laws are an agreement among all of us that this is, these are the rules by which we can all play together and live together. There shouldn't be any one particular rule that is so punitive to any one particular class of people. Mm-hmm. And that's a constitutional right. So that if you do, right, then you're in this lopsided society and it's not functional. Ultimately there will be that group of people that will rise up and there will be a revolution. And we saw that with, all of the historical cases from, Brown versus Board of Education to the Yick Wo case to, all of the English-only speaking cases. Mm-hmm. Time and time again, we've seen that kind of revolution, because mm-hmm. it's needed. It's needed when you don't have a society or a government that is fairly administering the rule of law.
And violence happens, even in our own country. The United States is not immune to internal strife. And so it's, kind of really sort of a very corrosive thing to undermine one's faith in that principle.
And I think it's hard to have faith when your, everyday worry is something like violence or persecution or prosecution. Mm-hmm. And so, we all have to figure out a way that, people come up with rules that make sense, and we come up with rules that protect people and at the same time empower them to be able to succeed in the society. So that has also a lot to do with, commerce, trade, and how we handle that at the local level, the national level, and international levels.
I wonder, one of the things that you've talked about is, and that is so important to your practice, is the right to a jury trial. In April 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court came down with this case called AT&T Mobility versus Concepcion, and that and a series of other cases have, for a large class of disputes and a large class of litigants, eliminated the right to a jury trial. And so we've seen this massive expansion in private dispute resolution, where there is generally no right to a jury trial and generally no right to an appeal the way one thinks about an appeal. I wonder if you have a view on that in the context of faith in the system and the rule of law.
One of the most important things about a jury trial is that it is public. It holds people accountable. Anybody can come to the courthouse and watch any dispute. So that's, I think, one of the cornerstones of having this adversarial system, where it can't be, shuttered down, it can't be swept under the rug. And one of the things about mandatory arbitration, it's just a mechanism for people to privatize, the wrongdoing. And so it becomes problematic from the standpoint of overall public safety, to not know about certain things that are happening, especially if they're large corporations that are, manufacturing goods and selling them and distributing them, in a mass way that affects many people. And then you don't hear about, as I say, the corporate practices on one level, or even, as they say, just the plain design manufacturing. And that's really the work that I do, is product liability end of it. And we, time and time again, see corporations trying to put layers of protection so that information doesn't get out to the public. And so that's one of the harms, I think, about shuttling things to, private judging. The other is, in the terms of what's being adjudicated or how it's being adjudicated, in general, I would say you feel safer with consensus than with what frequently happens, which is a single neutral arbitrator making a decision. Because again, it's, one point of view versus, at a minimum, in our state court cases, 12 points of view. And they don't really get it wrong. In my jury trials, what I frequently see is a pretty diverse group of people. And I don't necessarily mean in gender or race, but with 12 people, it's 12 different world perspectives. And even for people who come from the same area, the same county, people who are baby boomers to Gen Xers to the Y generation and millennials, they all come from different perspectives. And when you take 12 different people with those varying perspectives, you get consensus about something that's right or wrong. And that's not the same as, a neutral arbitrator who generally is trained in the law. I mean, the person that we end up, I also do Kaiser arbitration cases, and I'm on the Kaiser Arbitration Oversight Board, and so one of the things that we see constantly is controversy about how fair is this system. especially if you have a pool of arbitrators. Where are they coming from? What are their biases? I mean, those are all things you look at. But, at the end of the day, it's one person making a decision with one worldview. Mm-hmm. And that person, you hope, is wise enough and compassionate enough, prudent enough to consider, more than one small thing in a case. Mm-hmm. And so those are, different angles of why I think it's so important to have an adversarial jury system. And when I say adversarial, I don't mean hostile. I mean that there are competing parties that have a right to present evidence, that have a right to cross-examine, and really do believe that cross-examination is one of the purest forms of being able to get the truth. So those are, as you look at those cases that uphold arbitration, I mean, really, it shouldn't be treated so broadly. It's an exception, not the rule. And those exceptions should be that people should fairly agree to it. It's contractual. I mean, you can agree to it, but, parties who are coming to that agreement should have some fair and equal way to get to that agreement. Mm-hmm. I mean, so frequently in these medical negligence cases where it's mandatory arbitration, the patients don't have any say in whether they're going to arbitration or not. But that's been upheld. And, in some ways that is to preserve some of the resources for our courts, for a whole lot of other disputes that will get resolved in court. But the mandatory arbitration process, can become really unfair and lopsided for either particular issues or even particular litigants, because they don't necessarily have the sophistication, to recognize all of their rights or get representation, for those rights that they're trying to assert.
You described that moment in law school when you were engaged in, I think you said it was a mock trial program, and feeling that you were kind of a fish in water, right? So you were standing up, using skills that felt right to you. Can you describe what that moment was like, and why that felt so right?
I think first it was because I had a voice. As a lawyer, we all have a voice because we're speaking for somebody else, a party. But when you're doing it in, a brief writing setting where you're never the person actually in court, or even if you're doing a lot of transactional work where it's very much behind the scenes, the voice doesn't seem to be as loud. It doesn't seem to be heard in the same way. And there is something incredibly powerful about spoken voices. I mean, certainly sometimes when you're reading a really great brief or a really great decision, that voice, you can hear it and it resonates. I mean, it's like reading, fantastic poetry, whether, you're a fan of Coleridge or Elizabeth Barrett Browning or, Seamus Heaney. I mean, it's got its own rhythm. And I think being able to speak up in front of people and use an oral voice just made me feel so powerful and and not in a way of like megalomaniac, yet powerful. I mean, it for the first time felt like I was invested in a cause or actually doing something that would make a difference, that would be heard. Mm-hmm. When you write something, you're not sure who's going to see it, read it, and how it'll be received or how it's being heard. And when you're speaking in front of people, you're making eye contact, you're seeing if they're receptive to it, you're adjusting your cadence, your analogies, your metaphors or similes, depending on who the audience is. And I think that engagement was very powerful to me, that you can understand, or at least have some cognizance about whether the people that you're addressing actually get what you're saying and whether they want to know more or whether they're done. Okay. And so I think for me, that moment of registering, understanding, with other people was probably the most, scintillating part for me. And then the other part is having, like I said, an adversary. You're speaking in opposition to somebody else, and somebody else is making really great points. But why I felt more strongly about mine was another thing that really clicked. Like, how we can disagree, but have civil discourse and still be very passionate and be exactly, I think, what the law tells us to be, which are zealous advocates. And we should be. I mean, that's what we are for our clients. And so getting a taste of that, I think, in law school, and it wasn't, it was a 2-week program, and it culminates with a jury trial. And so being able to speak again to, a body of people, trying to figure out if the points I was making was actually resonating or coming across, and hoping that it was, and learning to improve every day that tool that we have, or those tools, your brain, your speech, your rhetoric, the analogies that you use, the approach to problem solving. And I hope that as we talk about this, whoever is listening to this, that you remember at the end of the day, lawyers are problem solvers, and that's really what we're supposed to do. People come with problems, our society comes with problems, and through the use of, like I say, a core common set of values, which are our laws, we find solutions.
So it sounds like it was using your voice, being heard, but also doing that in a competitive environment. That's, boiling it down, that's what made it seem so appealing to you at that time.
I think so. I think you captured it correctly.
Well, I know that another way that you have spent time is coaching basketball. When you were at Lowell, did you also play basketball?
I did. I played on the Lowell High School basketball team, which, go Cardinals. It used to be the Indians when I first started there, but became the Cardinals actually because one of the students raised a very good question about what the reflection was upon our values with having Native Americans as a mascot. So it was an interesting glimpse into, what I would later find to be really important work. But I played basketball. I also ran track and cross country, and so I suppose the competition started early.
And what position did you play?
I was a shooting guard.
And can you describe what was the difference between what you thought law school would be about and how you actually experienced it?
Oh, I really did not know what to expect. One thing about Lowell High School in San Francisco is it's incredibly competitive. And I really, at the tender age of 17, I really didn't think that academia would be any harder than Lowell. Lowell seemed very hard. And so I didn't think that law school was going to be that hard. I actually kept my full-time job during the day. It was one difficulty about telling my mom I was going to law school, which was, my fear that she would just think that I wasn't interested in working. So in my family, I'd say they're all hard workers. My mom, I mentioned, is one of the strongest woman that I've ever known. And she worked so hard. Cleaning houses, later in her life being a caretaker for elderly, and taking care of us. It's no small feat with 4 kids running around in all very rambunctious and unctuous, and not always great kids at all. But it did make me feel like I had to work. And so the first year of law school, I worked at Folger, Levin and Kahn. I worked there as a paralegal and went to school in the evenings and made school not the priority. And people told me at the time, you really shouldn't do it that way. You should really kind of flip this. And I think I just thought I could do it. But by the end of the first year, I realized that was not the smart approach. And so I switched into the day program and decided, I guess, really school should be the priority. I mean, if this is going to be your profession, your craft, you really need to prioritize it. But, my first year experience was, I got to watch a trial. The place where I was working, there was an active environmental indemnity case going on. There were some sites in the Fresno area that had undergone Superfund cleanup because of all of the toxic dumping that had been done. And the case, was distilled down to who should contribute to that cleanup. And so, I got to watch some great trial lawyers get ready for trial and help them prepare for trial. And that was way more interesting than sitting in a classroom. And so my experience was a little bit of a hybrid that first year. But I think what law school never really quite prepared me for was how we really have to run the law practice. I mean, you're really also, now as a shareholder in my law firm, nobody talks about the business side of it. Which there should be some discussion about that, but the important part is that we all understand what the fundamentals of being advocates are, and that does start with constitutional issues, constitutional rights, upholding the law, upholding the rule of law, and then from the rest of that you can figure it out. So I think I didn't really understand then how important that philosophy would be, and so I do want to say that at USF I felt like that philosophy was well ingrained in us. You could really accomplish anything if you kind of get the core value. And the core value starts with just those things I've talked about, and the rest of it you can figure out.
Doris, it seems like, at least compared to other attorneys that I know, the training that you got in law school and also working full-time as a paralegal at Folger, Levin, and Kahn during the day, your experience during that period in law school, you probably had kind of a more direct insight into what practice actually was like. But I wonder if there were things that surprised you once you started practicing, things you didn't expect while you were a student.
I don't know that I expected the intensity. Two things, I suppose. One, the intensity. When you're in law school, you are in class for a certain amount of time and you have time off. And when you're working, and really focused as a lawyer, you really need much more stamina because you're genuinely working, 12 and plus hours a day. And you just have to learn to develop some stamina for that and learn how to take breaks. The other thing that you don't really get is how to interact with clients. I mean, to connect with people, to empathize with their struggles as a result of whatever dispute that they've brought to you, is really a talent, I think, you have to learn. Because now it's not just burying yourself in books, it's gathering information, using all of those skills to really listen to people and hear what it is that they need or what they want, because sometimes it's not what even the law can provide. And so that's not as much of what we learn about in law school. And so the day-to-day interactions of having real clients, real people that you're servicing, that you're addressing, I think that didn't connect entirely. It's so theoretical in law school. You're reading cases about people, about these parties that are written from, the 30,000 view as opposed to really the 4-foot view and sitting across from the person.
Right.
And so I think that that was another part that was eye-opening and really enjoyable for someone like me. That, I mean, even as we were doing the trial advocacy work, you're talking at people. You know, the jury trials are opening statements, closing arguments, those are monologues. You don't get receptive feedback. You know, the only time that you do is jury selection,
right, when
you actually get to engage and find out. And even then, you know, you're finding out limited information. So that, I suppose, the human-human interaction of the law is not something that everybody gets the experience of. I do think decisions are made, you know, well, both from this cognitive standpoint, but also, you know, your gut and your heart. But what drives those decisions first is the issue. And how do we frame the issue? And that is the first part that comes with listening. And that's what I mean by when you're listening to your client's needs, because some of them can't be addressed by the law. I have calls, you know, from a lot of people who look for lawyers they want nothing to do with what the law can provide. You know, it's compensation. I mean, it's monetary compensation is really what the law can provide. Or injunctive relief sometimes, you know, but the other things like getting your life back, getting your loved one back, sometimes, you know, we are really genuinely just counselors. And when we say that we're counsel, there's real meaning to that sometimes, because the best thing that I can do, and I have done for some people, is simply listen and let them have their voice as well, to at least somebody who heard it, even if there was nothing more that I could do. And so when I think about, you know, what you just mentioned, what's the disconnect between law school and real life practice? It's actually human interaction. You know, so much of law school is sitting in the classroom, you know, listening to information, to data, really, from your professors, and then digesting it, turning it around into something written. But unless you're in a clinical course, you know, you don't have that interaction with people. And that takes away, as I said, from having real empathy, learning to have real empathy for all walks of life. And, you know, whatever the issue is, whatever the background of the person is, to, you know, be able to hear them, see them, and put yourself in those shoes and say, okay, if I were this person, what do I really need? And what do I really want from this? So, yeah, I think trying to break out of the, you know, constantly just thinking mode of law school, and the other mode of engaging, relating, and being human does get lost, I suppose, in law school as opposed to real practice.
And in learning how to be an effective counselor and trial lawyer, how did you, are there any you know, sort of suggestions that you can give to a new lawyer to you know, who's as they're on that path to listening, you know, finding that connection, that humanity in their practice and in their profession?
I think two things I would say: don't ever stop reading, and keep traveling. I mean, it's so important, I think, to meet people from all walks of life, because the people you represent will never be just one cookie cutter anything. You know, they will come from all walks of life and all types of world experiences. And if you don't let yourself, you know, go outside of your comfort zone, you never really engage, you never really learn to empathize or hear what people go through. I mean, some of the best things that have happened to me in my travels with these trainings is, you know, seeing how people are affected by their surroundings, hearing from people what is important to them, finding out what makes, their life valuable. And you don't get that unless you're willing to talk to people, and you don't really get the diversity of that unless you're willing to travel outside your comfort zone. So I'm a big proponent of travel as much as you can, talk to as many people as you can. Everybody, from the person who serves you at the restaurant to the person that drives you from one location to another, visit interesting places. I used to think that museums were so boring, but I love museums now because you learn about what's important to people. I mean, art is a reflection of what a particular artist thought was important to them in that moment. And so understanding people's values, that there's a place for that where, in fact, a whole storehouse called the museum where they've kept relics of things of importance to, this society, this culture, or individual people. And so I think that's really the value of travel, is, as I say, you can't empathize with people unless you can get exposure to different types of everything, And then the reading, again, is just a reflection of linear thought and different world perspectives. I mean, no matter who you're reading, my dad, actually, one of the things that he did was he was a poet, and he wrote poetry, and I have a collection of his poetry beginning from when he was 7 years old.
Wow.
And so we had them translated from Chinese to English. And, I can get an understanding, a flavor for, different stages of his life. And it helps me learn about him. So books that we read, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, newspapers, journals, I mean, all of that is helping us understand somebody else's cognitive processing and, the lens through which they see the world. So, and I think, our best tools for relating to people come from talking to them and come from reading. Because if you can come up with an analogy, in trial that relates back to something everybody else has experienced, that really helps them, see your point of view. And so I'm a big proponent of read, talk to people, travel to different places.
In some ways, you've grown up in the law, even though you may not have had a lot of firsthand role models kind of before law school. You served as a paralegal. You worked in a law firm while you were a first-year law student. You later were connected to what would become your law firm for your career. And looking back on that period of time, is there anything that you can convey to a law student or to a younger attorney about what it is that makes you successful at what you do? I know very difficult to encapsulate in a few words, but you've had so many trials. You work long hours, long days for for a period of years. I mean, looking back on that body of experience, is there something that you can convey that captures what makes you so good at that work?
Well, first, I'm going to say that I there are people who have tried so many more cases than I have, and so much more successfully. We have San Francisco is just like a den of incredible trial lawyers. But I think it first starts with, understanding this is a profession, and that if you're in law school and you're going to practice law, that this is your craft, and you want to get good at it. And there are a handful of things that we need to be good at. And one of them is writing. You have to be a good writer. And in order to write something really well, this comes back to what we were saying, you have to be able to process information in a way that will help people relate and understand what you're saying. And so I think to be good at this, this comes back to writing and meeting people and talking to people, because everything that we write about is to convey really a story. And a story has a point. You know, when we're practicing law and we're giving an opening statement, it's the story of what happened to, you know, one particular party or three parties or however many people are involved. And there's a point to it. The point is, you know, somebody was unjustifiably wronged in this whole process somehow or another. If you're on the defending end of it, it is, you know, there is somebody who was wronged, and it's my client who is being accused of something that they were undeservedly being accused of. So everybody has a story, and I think for us to be really good at our craft, we need to understand how to tell somebody else's story. And so again, learn how to read, to write, and to speak. So I think as we think about, you know, the Asian American Bar Association, and I was fortunate, and thank you very much for having me participate in the women's panel, the APA women's panel, because I got to listen to so many different women, so many different perspectives. And I would say one thing that all of us agreed upon was that you have to be a good oral communicator. And that is one of the most important ingredients to being a really good lawyer, is you have to have these skills of being able to communicate in a way that people are receptive to the information. So then it's not just all about, you know, the thinking process or even the words that are coming out, but it's the way in which you use those words. You know, what comes first? What goes next? How do we end? How do we use all of these? How do we use our body? How do we use our voice, our pitch, our tone, our demeanor to really get somebody's attention, to get our point across, to convince somebody as to why, you know, they should decide something in a way that is favorable to your client.
Doris, you've explained how your mom was one of the strongest people that you've ever met. And I know that you experienced some loss in your life. 2013, your mom passed. You continue to work incredibly hard. I know you do, because you volunteer for trials that you don't have to volunteer for. But you know, looking back on your work and you know, your parents' experience, your experience, what makes for a meaningful life?
I think the relationships that you build. You know, my father also passed away, and he passed away in 2010. My mom passed away 3 years after he did. But the relationships that we have, I mean, the work that we do, for me, it is about people. And so I was in trial not too long ago in April in Los Angeles, and it was a case that one of my partners was getting ready for, and I asked if he needed help on it, and he brought me along to try it with him. But one of the most meaningful things that came out of that trial was really developing a relationship with our client who had lost her son in a bus accident. Her son was riding his bicycle in Los Angeles and had changed lanes, and the bus struck her son while he was on the bicycle, and he ended up underneath the bus and was killed as a result of that. The fascinating thing about this case was it was not there's no standard wrongful death case. I mean, in California, there really isn't. Because again, it's about relationships, right? What was the relationship between this mother and her son? And that was, you know, the basis of the claim for damages. And she had been estranged from her son from his age of 3 to 12. And we had to explain that to the jury. And actually it came about because of some cross-examination of her current husband. And the defense attorney had asked some questions to her current husband about, you know, when he knew about the existence of her son. And, you know, it gave the impression, and it gave the wrong impression, that somehow she didn't care about her son between the ages of 3 and 12. And that really wasn't the case. And this was an incredibly moving and powerful story because she had never told it before. And she was going to be one of the last witnesses. And I met with her and her husband and her now 18-year-old daughter to talk about, what was the relationship and why was it that she was absent in his life during those 9 years. And she described to me, such a powerful, moving story that she had never really dealt with or confronted before. And it was, she had left home at a young age. She had been abused by a family member while she was only, young, 14, and emotionally abusive family member. And she ended up leaving California for Chicago. And she left with an older gentleman who was 10 years older than she, so she was a minor at the time. And he physically and sexually abused her. She became pregnant with this child and tried to raise him and take care of him. The relationship or the abuse was so bad that she ended up leaving, but being unable to take her son with her, and was threatened really for the rest of her life. And so the heartbreaking part of this story as well was the only way that she could be able to see her son was to continue working at this pizza parlor that was nearby the school where he attended, and she could watch him walk to school every day, and that was her connection. And even in the course of that 9 years when they were separated, and her son didn't even know her or recognize her as his mother, they did have some contact, and the father of that boy approached her and threatened her. And it wasn't until he was 12 that the school discovered that he was being physically abused at home. And then she regained full custody and had this reunification with her son, who had never known her. And so that was such a powerful story that we were able to bring out in court. But it was cathartic for her, and it was a change for her, because this was never, as I said, something that had ever been addressed with even her own, children and family. And so to understand what she went through, to be able to have her talk about it with strangers, and to be able to confront it in her own life. I mean, this is where, when we say we are, as lawyers, we are spokespersons for somebody else, that, I think, is such powerful speech, helping somebody else bring that information to the forefront in a way that is honest and truthful and has a point. There was a reason for telling that story. It wasn't just to garner sympathy. It was not at all to garner sympathy. It was to explain, something that the defense raised as an accusation for not having a strong enough relationship with her son, when in fact she really did. I mean, she, built that relationship, from scratch when he was 12 up to the age of 21 when he passed away, and it was such a tremendous loss. But, coming back to your question then about what makes life meaningful, and it's not all about work, but when work is about taking care of people, engaging with people, and building relationships with people, it's what makes work meaningful. And for me, it translates into all these other parts of life, which is, the relationships that I have with my family. You mentioned my parents, but, and this seems probably just traditional, perhaps, in Asian culture, but I think today it's not always done. I think our families and the Asian cultures are very accepting of not taking care of them to the end of their life. But, for my family, it was really important. For me, it was such a privilege to have both of my parents live with me until they died. And it's a privilege to be somebody's caretaker. It is a privilege to be somebody's voice. It is a privilege to serve their needs. And so I think that is the extension. It's not just with our families, it's with our colleagues, our coworkers, it's with our, the families that we develop on the different boards that we serve. I don't think, at least for me, I can't compartmentalize, work from, quote, fun or anything else, because I think I'm constantly building relationships that cross over in places. And that's probably the most meaningful thing.
All right. Thank you, Doris.
Thank you very much. Charles, it's wonderful thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing those stories.